It's Friday, May 15th. I'm Brian Walsh, and welcome to This Week in Impact, where I talk with ImpactAlpha journalists and editors about some of the most interesting impact investing stories we've been covering. This week, I'm joined by editor David Bank. We'll discuss how Los Angeles is working to lower the cost and complexity of capital for affordable housing, plus the Southern Poverty Law Center controversy and who really controls the funds in donor-advised funds. And finally, we'll look into a $140 million deal to build a sustainable aviation fuel plant in Egypt. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to have you back. I know you were traveling to different conferences in recent weeks, and you're going to another conference next week, right?
Yeah, I'm super excited. I get to go to Peru for the first time. The Gender Lens Investing Conference put on by Pro Mujer is there in Lima in a couple weeks.
All right. Sounds exciting. I look forward to your report. But first up this week, David, you wrote about how LA County has a new approach to financing affordable housing. Tell us about this new social bond that was recently passed and why some think it might be a replicable solution for other places seeking to build affordable housing.
Yeah, as you know, I'm a Californian and actually was raised in Los Angeles. And California and Los Angeles, for that matter, rarely gets any cred or credibility in affordable housing. But La Casa, the LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, has an approach that I think has some promise. Their analysis shows that the obstacles to affordable housing is not, NIMBYism or environmental regulations or land use permitting and that sort of thing. It's actually financing. And they've come up with a way to make the cost of capital cheaper for affordable housing developers. These are mostly nonprofit housing developers who will be able to get essentially below market capital for a good chunk of their financing and thus make their projects pencil out and not only kind of be cheaper, but be quicker. And so the experiment that's going to be run for about 20 projects that La Casa, as it's known, is going to finance through this bond is that about half of them will use the low income housing tax credit. If you're a houser, that has LIHTC, and it's a federal tax credit that has been very instrumental in bringing institutional capital into affordable housing over many decades, but has become, at least in the eyes of some housers, overly cumbersome and bureaucratic and adding not only time, but layers of financing to these projects. And each layer of financing, each new government agency or funder that you need to bring in adds something like 3% to the cost of a project. You get 5 or 6 or 7 of those, you're starting to really inflate the cost. So streamline the project, lower the cost of capital, get projects moving faster so you're paying interest for shorter amount of time, and you really can take a chunk out of the cost of housing and actually deliver these projects more quickly. So we'll be watching this social bond and then these projects because they're supposed to break ground within 12 months.
So walk us through the capital stack here. How does La Casa kind of act as a one-stop shop?
Yeah, so La Casa is what's now known as a regional housing authority. There's ones in San Diego and San Francisco as well. And this is something that exists in other parts of the country, but is new to California. And what makes La Casa in LA different is that the voters there a few years ago passed a half-cent sales tax countywide. And that gives La Casa something like $385 million a year. A part of that is being used as essentially a guarantee or a risk reduction on this bond. And so because the risk of any kind of default is much lower, the interest rate that the bond is required to pay out is much lower, something like 4 percentage points. So the difference between, say, something above 7% and something below 4%. And that makes, in turn, the capital to these housing developers cheaper. So it's essentially a catalytic capital play where this risk reduction brings in lower cost commercial, institutional capital from bond buyers, and then makes that available to these nonprofit housing developers.
So David, in California, the home of Silicon Valley, where they do A/B testing in software development, I found this kind of intriguing that La Casa is doing this A/B testing with this pilot project of the 20 projects. Walk us through that.
Yeah, it will be fascinating as these projects go forward. La Casa's Ryan Johnson says their analysis says that if you don't use the low income housing tax credit, you can deliver these projects something like 12% more cheaply, and that is a cost of capital, and it's also this layer cake of capital that more folks getting fees, frankly, off of that money, and then also you could do it faster. You also save money. So what's going to be interesting is that the low income housing tax credit might in fact be raising the cost of affordable housing. There's lots of problems, in terms of when that money gets matched, when it gets released, what else you have to put in place. You can spend lots of time chasing all those requirements, perhaps not necessarily jumping through all the hoops. Your project might fall apart. You have to start again. In a lot of cases, the LIHTC projects turn out to end up being smaller than they were when they were first proposed, because you have to shrink the cost of that project to be able to fit the now more expensive financing. And so you actually build less units. So there's all kinds of nuances and complexities in affordable housing financing. And La Casa is trying to streamline the process, lower the cost of capital, get projects done more quickly.
As we all know, time is money.
Yeah, and it's not just money for the developers, but it's also time to market and time to get folks living in these houses. So California has I think is always known in superlatives. The highest cost of housing, the most homeless, all those kinds of things. So this is a little bit of a breath of fresh air. Obviously, a small start, but it could be ramped up. The muni bond market is something like $4 trillion, and if you can engineer these issues right, you can bring a lot of money to bear for affordable housing.
Yeah, catalytic capital having that higher leverage. All right, well, you can read David's piece on the new financing mechanism for affordable housing in Los Angeles on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. Later in the show, we'll discuss a deal that may help reduce the carbon emissions of the airline industry. But for now, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, how donor-advised fund operators are restricting client donations to certain politically charged charities.
Hi there, Agent of Impact. This is Dennis Price, CEO of ImpactAlpha. For more than a decade, ImpactAlpha has been helping you find the alpha in impact. We've now built ImpactAlpha Edge to bring you structured data and market intelligence to help you move faster, invest smarter, and multiply your impact. ImpactAlpha Edge is designed to help GPs and fund managers raise capital more effectively. LPs and allocators find each other and discover overlooked opportunities. Think of it as a purpose-built pitch book for impact, with the editorial judgment and network trust that no algorithm can replicate. Come check it out. Book a demo today. Learn more about ImpactAlpha Edge in our show notes.
Next up, when you hand your money to a financial intermediary like a donor-advised fund, do you actually control what it does? We recently had a guest post from Morgan Simon weighing in on news that 3 of the largest donor-advised funds, or DAF platforms, those are Fidelity Charitable, Vanguard Charitable, and Schwab's DAF Giving 360, suspended client grant recommendations to the Southern Poverty Law Center, following a Trump administration DOJ indictment that many are calling politically motivated. David, this is a case of a financial intermediary making a values-laden decision about whose money flows where, with many clients learning that the A in the DAF does indeed stand for advised, not controlled. So what's really at stake here?
Yeah, this is, sort of an object lesson in DAFs, and DAFs have become something of a flashpoint. There's something like $330 billion sitting in these donor advised funds. And it's not only the big 3 that you mentioned, but lots of community foundations, other nonprofits also manage donor advised funds, which are kind of like mini foundations in a way. Once you contribute to your DAF, you get the tax break, just as if you were contributing to a charity. In fact, it is technically a charity. And then you can advise that plant sponsor on who you would like to make grants to. In some cases, as we've been following, you can also advise how you would like the money to be invested. So you could actually make impact investments out of your donor advised fund as well. But for both of those, the point is that the money is actually controlled by the sponsor, by the Fidelity or the Vanguard or the Schwab or the Community Foundation, as the case may be. And they are making the actual decision. You are advising them. And that's sort of appropriate in the sense that you've gotten your tax break and it's not your money anymore, but you do get the privilege of advising them. They may or may not take your advice. The case that Morgan Simon and others have commented on is that some of these donor advised fund sponsors have made the decision not to pass along or not to fulfill the requests of their donors to pass the money through to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is something of a storied civil rights outfit that has tracked down a lot of Ku Klux Klan members and old cases, and keeps a list of white supremacist hate groups, and as you can imagine, has gotten itself into a number of heated battles, legal and otherwise. And as you said, the Trump administration has secured an indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center, the details of which are complicated, but has to do with paying informants in some of these groups and whether that's an appropriate use of their money. And that case will go to trial and there'll be some kind of decision. But even without a conviction, those big three DAF providers have stopped passing along contributions, and that is obviously hurting the finances of that organization.
So are the nation's largest donor advised fund platforms, are they pausing this based on just standard policy that whenever there is a indictment of a nonprofit that they suspend donor grant recommendations to that nonprofit, or is this because it is this nonprofit in the crosshairs of this administration?
Well, I think the different outfits have had different responses to that, and I think there's also some reporting out there that shows that it's whatever the policy is, it's not always uniformly applied. And really, Morgan's point was a broader one, which is, do you know who really controls the money or the decisions when you outsource some of these things to third parties, and particularly to major financial institutions? So, for example, you might have a financial advisor, and in that case, the ownership is flipped, where you actually do retain a decision-making authority, but your advisor presents you with a menu of, say, investment opportunities. And in many cases, you just go along with what your advisor recommends, even though you do retain control, but you don't necessarily see all the alternatives and the opportunities that the advisor hasn't brought to you. And then in another case, sometimes folks outsource their proxy voting rights, and they send it to a proxy advisor like Institutional Shareholder Services. And last year, ISS changed its voting guidelines around ESG and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of votes. And so you may not actually realize exactly how your proxy advisor is voting your proxies. So these are all sort of examples of the dangers of outsourcing decision-making in all sorts of ways to financial institutions or any institution that might have other agendas, including, as you say, possibly making sure they don't run afoul of the administration.
Now, speaking of shareholder advocacy, we had another guest post this week by the Jewish Investor Network, the JIN, which is a newly formed coalition of Jewish investors, families, foundations, and rabbis. And they're making the case about PayPal and its public behavior, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, that will be on the ballot at the annual general meeting of PayPal in the next week or so, and it has to do with who can access PayPal's payment services, and this has been going on for at least a decade. And as I understand it, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza who bank with banks in those areas are not eligible to use PayPal's services to make transfers and payments, while Palestinians in Israel and also Israelis in the Palestinian occupied territories are able to do that. And so this is something that has rankled investors and activists for quite some time. It's coming to a vote, and this Jewish Investors Network, a newly formed outfit, is trying to raise the visibility of it. And we had a guest post on that topic.
All right. Well, you can read Morgan Simon of the Candide Group's guest piece urging donors and investors to be deliberate about who holds and manages their money, and the Jewish Investor Network's guest post about PayPal on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in the show notes. For now, we're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, what a $143 million deal for a sustainable aviation fuel plant in Egypt signals about efforts to lower aviation's carbon emissions. Finally, this week, Lucy and Gigi reported for us on a deal by the UK/South Africa-based fund manager 91, which arranged a $143 million debt package for Green Sky Capital to build the Middle East and North Africa region's first sustainable aviation fuel plant in Egypt. Now, David, sustainable aviation fuel hasn't yet taken off, pardon the pun, because of the green premium in higher cost to produce it. But with the war in Iran roughly doubling traditional jet fuel prices, the economic case for sustainable aviation fuel is becoming more compelling. So to start us off, David, what do we mean by sustainable aviation fuel, and just how sustainable is it?
Well, it's basically alternatives to fossil fuel based kerosene and other things that run fuel. And it's fascinating how many things can become jet fuel, and it ranges from kind of yard waste or even kitchen waste. Bacon grease, I think, is what people think about, or French fries. But also people can grow corn or soybeans and turn it into jet fuel as well. And so where the biomass comes from turns out to be very central to whether or not so-called sustainable aviation fuel really reduces greenhouse gas emissions at all. As you said, it becomes interesting for another reason, which is sort of more of a energy security and even just a supply chain kind of basis. I mean, they're thinking that there may not be enough jet fuel, for example, in Europe if the Strait of Hormuz doesn't open to fly all the flights back and forth across the ocean. And so folks are looking for all kinds of ways to sort of extend the stocks of jet fuels with possibly more biomass-based fuels. So there's lots of pressure now to bring sustainable aviation fuel. It's got even its own three-letter acronym of SAF or SAF to market. But the sustainable part will spark a debate in many environmental circles.
Yeah, David, we just talked about the A in DAFs being for advised, and I wonder if the S in SAFs really does stand for sustainable. Is it truly more sustainable?
Well, you are still burning fuel in the engine. I think that the literal operation of the engine, actually one reason why people like SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, is that it can be cycled in to existing engines and existing fuel lines and whatnot. It's essentially indistinguishable from the fossil fuel based jet fuel, and it does burn in that regard exactly the same way. So your air flight, still emits just what it would. What's different is the supply chain getting to that fuel, and that again matters. In this case, in Egypt, the biomass does seem to be coming from yard waste, from kitchen waste, from other things that are not being grown specifically to make fuel, which also puts pressure on food supplies and raises food prices and possibly causes food shortages. So this is another case where there's lots of intricacies and nuances in how this all comes together and whether it actually pays off on the sustainability side.
All right, well, you can read Lucy's deal flow piece on the sustainable aviation fuel plant in Egypt on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian, as always.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks as always to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.